When Pope Leo XIV dismissed Cardinal Tagle during a global address, the marble silence of the Vatican was shattered. The world, watching through flickering screens and digital streams, did not blink fast enough to catch the meaning beneath the gesture. A cardinal stripped of duty, not in rage, not in disgrace, but in absolute, unsmiling calm. There was no thunder. No anger. No accusation. Just the unmistakable weight of holy conviction resting in the Pope's folded hands. It was a dismissal without scandal, but not without consequence. Cardinal Tagle had been a symbol, charismatic, eloquent, the quiet diplomat of the East. To many, he was the Church's future. To some, he was the one voice who could bridge the old and the new. But in that moment, stripped of office before the world, he was simply quiet. Too quiet. And Leo knew what the silence meant. The cameras didn't capture what followed. They did not see the doors close behind the College of Cardinals. They did not feel the change in the air, nor hear the single phrase Leo whispered into the stillness, a phrase that caused one bishop to weep, and another to remove his ring. No press release could explain what happened in that room. No journalist would ever be allowed near it. But those who were present, those few who stood in the circle of truth, left different men. Some trembling. Some raging. One resigned the next day. And yet the Pope said nothing more. Because what happened behind those doors wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. It was spiritual warfare. And the man who once walked barefoot through the ruins of Aleppo, who once prayed over the charred bodies of orphaned children, had finally drawn a line, not in policy, but in fire. One act. One whisper. And the Vatican would never be the same again. Before we enter this private room, before we pull back the veil the world was never meant to see, comment where you're watching from. Because after this, you may never look at obedience, silence, or holiness the same way again. He had been called the people's cardinal. Luis Antonio Tagle, born of gentle eyes and a diplomat's tongue, had moved through the church like a soft breeze in a burning room, bringing comfort, intellect, and careful words to spaces long suffocated by rigidity. In Asia, he was revered. In the West, he was respected. And in Rome, he was watched. Carefully. Closely. Cardinal Tagle was not the kind of man who made enemies. He listened. He smiled. He postponed conflict in favor of understanding. But in recent years, his silence had deepened. Not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of hesitation. And Pope Leo XIV had noticed. Leo, unlike his predecessors, had no taste for delay. He was not elected by accident. The conclave had whispered of his radical sermons in Syria, of his nights spent in war zones with the broken and abandoned, of the letters he received from nuns and soldiers alike, describing a man who washed their feet in bombed-out sanctuaries. He did not rise through the church by favor, he rose by fire. The fire of conviction. The fire of pain endured, seen, and transformed into truth. And now, seated beneath the shadow of St. Peter's dome, that same fire burned in his gaze. The press room that morning felt different. It wasn't the weight of anticipation, but the absence of it. The cardinals in the audience did not know why they'd been summoned. Neither did the reporters seated in the back, pens poised, eyes scanning faces for signs of trouble. The screens behind the papal chair were blank. No agenda. No bulletins. Just the slow creak of leather as Pope Leo rose from his seat and lifted a single sheet of paper. He didn't glance at the cameras. He didn't look at the sea of robes before him. His eyes found Tagle, seated 3 rows back, hands folded in the stillness he had mastered so well. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, Leo said quietly. Your service has ended. No anger. No spectacle. A collective gasp was swallowed by the velvet acoustics of the room. Someone dropped a pen. Someone else whispered a prayer in a language no one recognized. And yet Leo's face remained calm, etched not with rage, but sorrow. The sorrow of a man who knew what he had to do, and how many would not understand. But the moment that followed, that's where the story truly began. He gestured. A single aide approached Tagle and handed him a sealed letter. No escort. No order. No chains. Just paper. And the gravity of consequence. Tagle did not protest. He did not bow. He simply blinked once, longer than necessary, then stood, turned, and exited the room like a man who had prepared for this day his entire life. And still, no explanation had been given. No crime. No failure. No scandal. Only the unmistakable burn in Pope Leo's eyes, clear, sorrowful, and absolute. For the first time in modern church history, a pope had stripped a cardinal of power, with no cause cited, no press release, no diplomatic exit. Just silence. And conviction. It wasn't policy. It was purification. And those in the room knew, this was not a man playing politics. This was a shepherd removing a wolf's shadow before the flock grew too blind to see. This wasn't about Luis. It was about what he didn't do. What he refused to say. What he allowed, by saying nothing at all. He had chosen diplomacy while children vanished. He had defended the church's image while the church's spine rotted quietly in regions no one dared to name. And Leo could not allow it to continue. If you're still watching, pause now and ask yourself. Do you believe silence is sometimes more dangerous than speech? If you do, then subscribe. Because what you're about to hear next isn't a scandal. It's a revelation. And it will demand something from your soul. Still won't subscribe? Then go to the comments. And write down what silence you've tolerated in your own life, and why. The silence that followed Tagle's departure was not empty. It was crowded, with questions, glances, and trembling restraint. The kind of silence that presses into the bones of a room and dares anyone to speak. And then, someone did. From the second row of the media pit, an elder Vatican reporter stood. A man who had covered 3 papal transitions, 2 conclaves, and 100 quiet scandals. He was respected, not for his sharpness, but for his reverence. He cleared his throat softly, but the tension in the room made it sound like thunder. Your Holiness, he began, voice steady, almost cautious. Many were anticipating Cardinal Tagle's appointment to the new global synod. May I ask, was he not fit for that responsibility? Pope Leo did not smile. He did not frown. He simply turned his head and met the man's gaze with a look that aged the room by 10 years. Fit, he repeated, as if tasting the word on his tongue. He was more than fit. Intellectually, spiritually, diplomatically, beyond fit. But the Church does not move by fitness alone. He stepped down from the dais, not in performance, but in conviction, and began to walk slowly across the stone floor, his voice low and unhurried. Obedience, he said, is not tested when everything is clear. It is tested when fire falls from heaven and we are asked to move, before the smoke clears, before the votes are counted, before the reputations are secured. He turned back to the press, eyes sharp, voice sharper. Cardinal Tagle hesitated. Not out of rebellion. Not out of pride. But out of fear. And fear, when disguised as prudence, is the most dangerous spirit of all. Gasps did not follow. Only breath held hostage. No one dared ask what fear he referred to. Not yet. Leo continued. This new synod is not a council of convenience. It is a call to urgency. The Church has entered a storm that will not wait for men to feel ready. The Spirit moves now. And those who hesitate when the Spirit commands become stumbling stones, no matter how clean their cassocks. The words landed heavy. Not as accusation, but as judgment spoken with sorrow. Across the marble floor, the cameras stayed fixed. But they could not catch what filled the space between his words, the unspoken admission that Tagle had known, had seen, had heard, and still chose silence. Leadership, Leo implied, was not a reward for loyalty. It was a burden granted only to those willing to bleed at inconvenient hours. And while Tagle may have worn the robes of a servant, he had chosen stillness at a time when the church needed movement. He had measured too long. And while he measured, the children wept. The widows prayed. The wolves advanced. He had spoken peace, when heaven demanded a sword. And yet, through it all, Leo did not rage. He mourned. Because he had loved Tagle, still did. But love does not excuse delay when the vineyard is burning. If you're still listening, ask yourself now. Have you ever called caution what was really cowardice? Have you dressed fear in the robes of wisdom, simply because you were afraid to offend? If you felt that sting in your spirit, subscribe now. Not for headlines, but for truth. Because what's coming next will not soothe you. It will search you. Still won't subscribe? Then go below, write in the comments what you would have done, had you been Pope Leo that morning. And if you would have kept Tagle, tell the world why. A younger journalist now stood, his credentials still fresh, his suit pressed too neatly for the weight of the room. He wasn't unkind, but he carried the confidence of one who had not yet suffered, at least, not publicly. His question cut through the still air without apology. Are you implying, Your Holiness, that Cardinal Tagle disobeyed you? No gasps this time. Only the tightening of shoulders, the shifting of pens on notepads, the kind of microscopic movements that betray a room waiting for fire. Pope Leo did not answer right away. Instead, he returned to his seat, slowly. Deliberately. He let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as invitation. Then he leaned forward, not into the microphone, but toward the people. His voice was low, not because he lacked power, but because the truth didn't need volume. I will not accuse, he said, eyes resting somewhere far beyond the room. But I will tell you a story. There it was. Not a defense. Not a rebuke. But a story. In the outskirts of Aleppo, he began, before the bombings reached their height, there was a boy named Samir. He was 12. His father was killed in the street, and his mother, well, she had no voice left to scream. They fled. Not for food, not for shelter. Just for breath. His voice slowed. They reached the church compound 2 miles east of the red zone. And there, the local priests had gathered, waiting for orders from Rome, waiting for clarity, waiting for diplomatic clearance. And while they waited, Samir waited too. Outside the gates. In the dust. Beneath a sign that read, Christ welcomes all. A pause. Not for drama. But for pain. 2 days later, Samir was gone. No one saw where. Some said he was taken. Others said the fever claimed him. His mother, what was left of her? Left a note beneath the church gate before disappearing. It said, we did not need your sermons. We needed your door open. Leo's hands clasped together. His eyes closed. Then opened again, clear, sharp, grieved. You ask if Cardinal Tagle disobeyed me. No. He obeyed policy. He respected protocol. He honored the structure. A beat passed. But while he waited for the ink to dry, the doors remained shut. The mother lost her son. And the church lost her voice. The room didn't breathe. We do not punish hesitation, Leo continued, but we cannot sanctify it either. The church is not a hospice for the comfortable. It is a battleground for the broken. If the light is on but no one dares to enter, then we are no longer a refuge, we are a museum of cowardice. His voice hardened, not with rage, but with sorrow transfigured into truth. There are bishops who manage reputations. Priests who count pews. Churches who polish glass while their neighborhoods rot in despair. And while they meet, while they plan, while they wait for the right moment, the children die. A single drop of sweat slipped down a cameraman's brow. And so I say this, when prophets whisper and the world burns, silence becomes betrayal. The words fell like stone into still water. Not a single soul in the room remained untouched. They sat beneath the weight of it, not an opinion, not a policy, but a verdict. Leo leaned back now, his shoulders somehow lighter. As though truth had lifted the burden of diplomacy from his bones. And somewhere, far away from the cameras, far from the press, there were voices that would never be heard. Children who had cried once, then never again. Mothers who had looked to the church, and found its gates closed. This, he would not allow any more. Not under his watch. Not under his name. If your heart aches at this, if you feel the tremor of that Syrian mother's prayer echoing in your soul, then subscribe now. Not to this channel. To the call. To the call that says comfort is no longer enough. That leadership without urgency is betrayal. That silence, in the face of the broken, is not neutrality. It is sin. Still unmoved. Then go below and write, would you have opened the gates for Samir? Or would you have waited for the papers to arrive? The air was no longer thick, it was suffocating. Every soul in that room, whether dressed in cassock or clutching a camera, felt the invisible hand of judgment resting on their shoulder. Not from Leo. From conscience. From history. And then came the voice that would push the room to its edge. It was the moderator, a man who had kept his posture impeccable until now, but whose hands now trembled slightly as he adjusted his microphone. His question came not as an attack, but as a whisper between wounds. Your Holiness, he said, was Cardinal Tagle the fire you were referring to, or the hesitation? It was not the question itself that cracked the floor open. It was the timing. The room had reached its moral ceiling. And this question, gentle in form, but loaded in spirit, pierced it. Pope Leo's eyes lifted. Not quickly. Not suddenly. Slowly, like a man rising from a prayer he never wanted to finish. His gaze swept across the room, but it did not linger. Until it landed on the chair where Tagle had sat just minutes before. His voice dropped, not out of exhaustion, but from the gravity that now took root in his very chest. I removed him, Leo said, not because he was wrong, he paused. The pause was surgical. Precise. But because he was silent when the church needed a roar. The words cut. Not like a sword, but like truth dressed in sorrow. And then, without warning, Leo stood again. But this time, his step carried something new. Not authority. Not even anger. Memory. He turned to the bishops seated in the first row. You remember the closed-door briefing 3 months ago, he said. The reports that came from the Philippines. The numbers. The routes. The children trafficked in crates marked as aid. The priests implicated. The nuns threatened. The photographs. No one moved. No one had to. Because they remembered. And who was there, he asked softly. Who received that briefing first? No one replied. He didn't wait for them to. Cardinal Tagle, he said. Born of that soil. Fluent in the tongue. Trained in the nuances of that land. He was briefed. Thoroughly. With tears. And evidence. He turned back to the press now, his eyes no longer sorrowful, but crystalline. And what did he do? Another pause. One so long it became scripture. He waited. The syllables fell like stones. He drafted a response, Leo continued. Consulted with diplomatic envoys. Contacted 2 local bishops. Sent letters of concern to the appropriate ministries. He wanted to be measured. He wanted to be careful. He wanted to do no harm to the image of the church. And then Leo's voice did something it had not done all morning. It burned. You call it wise to wait. I call it wicked to watch. The words echoed. Not metaphorically, literally. The acoustics of the chamber returned the phrase in soft repetition, as if even the stone refused to forget it. I wept when I read those reports, Leo said. I did not sleep for 3 nights. And Tagle wrote a speech. No bitterness. Only grief weaponized into clarity. I do not question his heart, Leo said, softer now. But hearts that beat slow while others bleed fast are no longer fit to lead. Then, silence. A silence that condemned no man outright, but stripped excuses from every robe in the room. If you're still here, listening with open ears, trembling spirit, and perhaps wet eyes, then understand this: leadership in the church is not about poetry. It is about response. And sometimes, holiness means kicking in the doors of hell when it tries to disguise itself as process. If your conscience stirs, if your stomach tightens, if you know what it is to delay when you should have acted, then subscribe now. Not to me. Not to this channel. But to the voice that says, move. Now. Still hesitant? Still unsure? Then go to the comments. And write what you think is worse, saying the wrong thing too quickly, or watching a child disappear. While crafting the perfect statement. The silence after Pope Leo's words was not respectful, it was stunned. It was the silence that arrives when righteousness makes no room for rebuttal. The young journalist, who had earlier questioned Leo with sharp but respectful inquiry, lowered his eyes. His voice, once filled with clarity, now trembled with hesitation. He did not speak again. No one did. Pope Leo walked forward once more. Not with pride, not with triumph, but with something far more dangerous to the systems in power: unflinching truth. You confuse diplomacy with discernment, he said quietly, and stillness with sanctity. His voice held no venom. Only weight. And that weight fell upon every official who had ever delayed mercy in the name of policy, who had ever polished theology while the children screamed beyond the cathedral walls. He reached into the inner fold of his vestment and withdrew a letter. A real letter. Its edges worn. Its ink slightly smudged. I was sent this 3 weeks ago, he said, holding the letter, not toward the cameras, not toward the press, but up, like a relic. A mother wrote to me from a small village outside Cebu. She had lost her daughter to traffickers who masqueraded as a Catholic mission. Her daughter was 12. Disappeared during confession. The man who took her wore a collar. There was no outcry in the room. Only the sudden sound of someone drawing breath too quickly. She tried to report it, Leo continued. But the priest had influence. The diocese denied responsibility. They said it was an isolated incident. And when she contacted the office of the cardinal, she received silence. He opened the letter now and began to read, voice steady. I prayed, Your Holiness. I waited. I believed. I did not shout. I did not go to the police first. I followed the path of obedience. And while I waited for a response from Rome, they found my daughter's body on the edge of a river. A gasp broke from one of the reporters. Another bowed his head. And one, older, silver-haired, with decades of church loyalty etched into the lines of his face, began to weep openly. Leo closed the letter and returned it to his chest. You want to talk about restraint? He asked, softly now, almost to himself. Restraint is for the strong who have already moved to protect. Not for the ones who have not yet decided whether to care. He turned to face the front of the room again. The church, he said, is not called to win debates. It is called to bleed for the broken. If our robes are still white while the innocent lie in blood, we are not priests. We are decorations. No one applauded. It would have been blasphemous to try. There were no cheers. No murmurs of agreement. Only the taste of judgment in the air. A sacred confrontation that left no man untouched. The younger bishops looked to the floor. The older ones closed their eyes. And every single camera in the room caught the image of Leo, standing still, shoulders straight, eyes glassed with tears he refused to shed, while the letter of a grieving mother rested over his heart. If you are watching this now, on a screen, in a room that is far too quiet, ask yourself, have you ever mistaken neutrality for holiness? Have you ever called delay wisdom, while others called for help? If that truth wounds you, good. Let it wound you clean. And if you feel that, if your chest is tight and your throat dry, subscribe now. Not for content. But for repentance. Still not ready? Then go to the comments and write this: what would you tell that mother? And would it be enough? Pope Leo remained still. The fire that had carried his words for the past hour began to cool, not into indifference, but into clarity. A kind of stillness that only arrives after a storm has done what storms are sent to do. His voice, when it returned, was gentler now. No less firm, but more measured. It was the voice of a surgeon who has already made the cut and now tends to the soul exposed beneath. This, he said, was never about Tagle. A breath passed through the room, subtle and restrained. This is not about a man's downfall, nor a cardinal's reassignment. It is about something deeper, darker, more ancient. The cost of silence in a screaming world. He looked to the back of the chamber, where no cameras reached, where the aides and junior clerics stood, some wide-eyed, some red-faced, all quiet. You cannot serve two altars, he said softly. The altar of comfort, and the altar of Christ. One will feed your image. The other will break your body. Then, turning once more toward the press and clergy alike, he continued, every pulpit, he said, is a place of power, but also of peril. You stand there not to be heard, but to be broken open. You don't preach because your voice is loud. You preach because the Spirit won't let you be silent. He let the word settle. This, he added, is not a rebuke. It is a rescue. Some looked confused. Others relieved. But all listened. Tagle, he said, is still my brother. That has not changed. That will not change. But I did not take this mantle to protect titles. I took it to guard the wounded. And the wounded do not need more brothers. He paused. They need shepherds. No fanfare. No applause. Just truth, lowered gently into the room like oil into a wound. And in that moment, every man present was forced to ask, am I a brother, or a shepherd? He stepped down from the platform. The lights above him dimmed slightly. He folded his hands. And though the room remained filled with tension, it was no longer the tension of confrontation, it was the ache of awakening. He had not destroyed anyone. He had exposed everyone. And now, it was up to them. If you feel that ache, if your chest is heavy with names you've forgotten, people you should have spoken for, moments when you waited too long, then subscribe now. Not to follow. But to turn. Not to agree. But to remember. Still hesitant. Still unwilling to say yes. Then speak below. Who have you left behind, while waiting to feel ready? Write their names. Write their stories. And ask yourself, were they asking for perfection? Or just a door that wasn't locked? What would you have said, if you sat in that room? Would you have cleared your throat, adjusted your collar, and defended the dignity of a friend whose silence had cost the vulnerable everything? Or would you have stood up, alone, uncertain, and spoken for the child no one would name, the mother no one heard, the cries no one recorded? Would you have clapped politely with the council, nodding as men in robes preserved their own peace? Or would you have wept, openly and without shame, with the child still waiting beyond the gates? These are not questions for history. They are questions for now. Because the church is not merely built with stone and incense, it is built with choices. And every generation must decide whether they will protect comfort, or consecrate truth. You do not need a pulpit to carry this burden. You need only a soul that still aches when others suffer. And if, after hearing this, yours still does, then do not walk away unchanged. Subscribe, not for spectacle, not for scandal, but for sacred awakenings. Because the doors of mercy are opening again, and God is still calling for shepherds. Still won't? Then go to the comments and write what truth here stirred your spirit, or exposed your silence. But do not leave this moment untouched. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. And may your soul not leave God's message for souls unchanged.